I bought Deathloop the day it came out. I've been interested in it since its announcement, but once IGN gave it a 10 out of 10, I just had to see what all the fuss was about. And it was great. I loved the guns, the special abilities, the quippy dialogue between Colt and Juliana. I loved it all. Except the ending. I did not like the ending. If you're worried about spoilers, don't be. My issue with the endings has less to do with what they do say and more to do with what they don't say. All three endings are abrupt, sudden, and don't resolve many of the game's central questions. I'd loved the game so much up until that point that I found myself grieving the loss of a story I had been invested in. But why is that? Lots of games have unresolved or even bad endings, and I don't even care. A lot of the times I don't care what the ending is, I just like the satisfaction of having completed a game. But somehow Deathloop failed to provide me with even that. Ultimately, I think it comes down to the game's narrative structure, and how it fails to satisfy a number of criteria key with the time looping genre. So, in order to figure out my issues with Deathloop, I decided to play a bunch of games with similar story structures and analyze them, in order to connect the dots about what Deathloop did wrong.
You want out of a time loop? You gotta learn how it works.
In Deathloop, you play as Colt, a man stuck in an infinite time loop on an island called Black Reef. In order to escape, you need to kill all 8 of the island's leaders, which the game calls visionaries, in one day. Deathloop's story is what I've decided to call a circular narrative. It's a story where the same key events repeat on a loop until the protagonist, who retains their memory between loops, can solve some sort of puzzle. In The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, you have to stop the moon from crashing into the Earth. In 12 minutes, you have to prevent your wife's murder. In the Outer Wilds, you have to stop the sun from exploding. It usually involves some kind of science fiction, but in a game like Overboard, the protagonist has a meta-awareness that the game is looping, even though those loops aren't necessarily canon to the story. One of the things that makes circular narratives so engaging is that the experience of the protagonist directly reflects the experience of the player. If Link jumps off a cliff in Breath of the Wild and dies, it creates a bit of a problem. Link in the story has to make it to the end to save the princess, so he can't actually truly die. Death in this case is a punishment for the player, but not the character. It's an incongruency we've come to accept because that's just how games are. But in the Outer Wilds, every death is canon. Whether you fly into the sun or jump off a high tower, the player's deaths are the character's deaths. It creates a certain type of immersion that's hard to come by in other genres, and I think it's why I was so invested in Colt and Deathloop. Anytime I was confused by a strange character or died or failed to understand a puzzle, Colt's frustration mirrored my own. We were one in the same. In a game with a circular narrative, getting a protagonist right is crucial because they're usually the only characters able to have a long-term arc. Everyone else is trapped in a cycle of 3 days, or 1 day, or 12 minutes. These side characters, by necessity, need strong personalities defined right from the start. In the Forgotten City, you can gauge the personality of whoever you're talking to from their first few lines of dialogue. Galerius is pretty immediately helpful. Sentius is powerful, but you can tell there's things he's not telling you. And Decius is just a jerk.
I mean, I can always buy a new slave girl if I still have my money.
As a player, these characters are all pieces of a puzzle that you're free to experiment with, but they have to have reliable, predictable behavior in order for them to feel fair. You learn their secrets, their desires, their weaknesses, and then push them to act certain ways to manipulate the story to your whim. Deathloop not only has a strong cast of archetypal side characters, but an antagonist named Juliana that also retains her memories between loops. Colt wants to break the loop, and she wants to protect it. This dynamic is fantastic, and the actors have wonderful chemistry.
The only way to protect the cycle
The only way to break this cycle
is to kill you.
Hands down, it's one of the best parts of the game, but when it comes to the ending, well, we'll get to that later. When the key events, side characters, and obstacles all remain the same every loop, the only way the plot can progress is if the player character / protagonist learns more about their environment and then changes the way they interact with it. In games with circular narratives, this causes the progression systems to fall into one of two categories: information-based or mechanics-based. The Outer Wilds is a perfect example of a game with information-based progression. You don't unlock new skills or abilities by completing objectives, you learn about the world by exploring and puzzle solving. Once you crack the secret of the game and learn how to beat it, you can do it almost immediately from your very first loop. The game does nothing to stop you. On the other hand, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask requires you to complete a number of objectives before you can actually complete the game. There are dungeons you have to beat, items you need to get, and for the first chunk of the game, you're stuck as a Deku scrub. Neither one of these is necessarily better or worse than the other. They each have their merits. Information-based games allow for more player freedom, while mechanics-based games provide a more guided narrative experience. The main reason I bring up the difference between these two progression systems is that completing them feels different to me. They're satisfying in different ways. When you complete the Outer Wilds, you have completed an intricately crafted puzzle about the nature of the universe. You feel the satisfaction of personal achievement. You've completed a puzzle. Beating Majora's Mask means that you've just experienced a meticulously crafted story about a bleak, dark, doomed world. In that case, I get the satisfaction of narrative completion. The issue here is that when I beat Deathloop, I feel neither of those things. As I mentioned earlier, to beat Deathloop, Colt is tasked with killing every visionary on the island in one day. It involves trickery, stealth, and coordination, but you won't perform the perfect loop until you're sure each of your individual assassinations will work out. The game actually leads you directly to this point with the leads page. It's truthfully a very helpful system, but it means the player doesn't have the personal satisfaction of cracking the case. You just follow the game's objectives until you reach the ending. And once you actually do perform the perfect loop, it's all gameplay you've done before, because you have to play the section in order to know if it works or not. That's fine though, because once you complete the perfect loop, you can go to your final boss fight with Juliana. Except, there's no boss fight, she just calls you into a room to talk to you. But that's also fine, because now is the game's chance to explain to you all the mysteries that have been leading up to this point. Except, that doesn't happen either. The endings of the game are each 5 minutes tops, and they raise more questions than they answer. The story ends, but it doesn't resolve many of the questions that are driving Colt and the player. What happens when you break the loop? What's going on in the outside world? And why are there multiple Colts running around? You can theorize from in-game notes or dialogue options, but there's nothing concrete to latch onto. The game just ends. Colt is there, about to learn all the information he wants to know, but the player is left powerless to learn more as the credits begin to roll. The tie between the protagonist and the player, that sacred connection that makes these games tick, is severed. And that is the issue I have with the ending of Deathloop. At its heart, a game with a circular narrative is a power fantasy about knowledge. When you live the same moments over and over and over again, when death becomes a mere inconvenience, can you unravel the secrets at the heart of the world? Can you prevent your wife's murder, or get away with your husband's murder, or stop the collapse of the solar system? Can you, after dying over and over and over again, stop the end of the world in Termina, in the Forgotten City, in Black Reef? Sometimes. The answer varies. Sometimes you can, and other times you're doomed to the inevitable, but at the end you always know why it happens. You learn the mystery at the core of the game. If this had been a game with a different story structure, I wouldn't have minded. I generally like ambiguous endings. But this is a game about investigating leads and finding solutions. It's about a character and a player that are so frustrated about the lack of information in the world that they just want to find out what's going on. It's about asking questions and fighting for the answers. And when the game doesn't satisfy any of those loose ends, I can't help but be disappointed. After all that, should you play Deathloop? I think so. Like I said earlier, the vast majority of the game is a great experience. I just wish I had gone into it knowing what I know now. That despite the theme of hunting for solutions, some questions just don't get answered. Thanks for watching.